Welcome back to the second panel of today's workshop. I want to congratulate all of the organizers for putting together such an amazing workshop that brings together speakers from many parts of the world and from different disciplines. I think I'm not alone in saying the first panel was absolutely fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the other panels that will follow. Sumi, your brief remarks in the opening workshop were powerful and helped frame the discussion. I'm incredibly honored and glad to chair this session, Conceptual Diversity in the Social Sciences, the second panel on that. It is crucial to examine conceptual diversity in the social sciences and focus on questions of epistemic justice, and to consider the role of translation and how practices of translation are shaped relations of power and privilege. As an anthropologist by training, but working in LSE's Department of Social Policy, I research civil society organizations and social movements and their relationship to development and humanitarian policies and practices. For that reason, I am acutely aware of the challenges of translating concepts and models and, and of creating space for local voices, understandings, practices, and knowledges. Throughout my research, I have witnessed how Western models and understandings of what constitutes development, community, peace, and well-being dominate. And even when these models and knowledges are shown to be problematic, ill-informed of local contexts and histories, and more than that, of creating unintended and harmful consequences, those in power who fund research and projects led by local researchers or NGOs continue to insist on the validity of those models, knowledges, and approaches, thereby marginalizing local knowledge and framing it sometimes as suspect or inadequate. In thinking about what constitutes the good life and well-being from the perspective of social policy and what social and economic relations are desirable, I have again and again witnessed that despite the nod to participatory approaches, liberal Western models of development and humanitarianism persist. And participatory approaches, despite the best intentions, become in practice superficial, tick-the-box performative exercises. In some instances, these hegemonic models and concepts, such as neoliberalism, achieve the status of what I've called gospel, in that it's very difficult to question them, even when those approaches bring harm to people and the environment. I've challenged those models in my own work, in my own research. And what gives me great hope is that in recent years, young researchers in Armenia, where I've done a lot of my field work, and other former Soviet countries are questioning the hegemonic models and resisting epistemic forms of injustice and silencing. They are working to decolonize knowledge production and practices of development, democratization, humanitarianism, and peace building. They are creating knowledge in Armenian rather than in the colonial language Russian or in the neo-colonial language of English to reclaim their history, culture, and power. They are engaging in what Gurminder Bhamra calls reparatory social science, which is so important. But as we acknowledge the flows and impact of power in non-Western contexts, my colleagues have already pointed out how the universities where we work are also sites of power. And my other role as the executive director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program, which is based at the LSE's International Inequalities Institute, I have the privilege to work in a program that brings together scholars, activists, practitioners, and policymakers from around the globe to the LSE. The Atlantic Fellows Program is a space where we embrace an approach that is centered on critical and dialogic pedagogy. We strive to make AFSI a space where fellows not only engage with research on inequalities produced by academics, but we invite fellows very explicitly to bring their knowledge and share their expertise and experiences to create new forms of knowledge and practice as we work together to build a values-led community that is committed to collective leadership aimed at tackling inequalities. For these reasons, I'm incredibly glad to be part of this workshop, which is actively questioning and challenging knowledge hierarchies and decentering them. I now turn to present to you our presenters. our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Our first speakers are Armand Azra bin Azlira and Isabel Medem from the LSE, who are part of a group of MSc students who are integrally involved in translating the call for papers into 12 languages. Our second speakers are Olga and Diana Kudaibergenova, who are examining debates on whether post-Soviet context can be considered post-colonial. Our third speaker is Macarena Gómez-Barris, a scholar and writer whose talk examines the proliferation of concepts grounded in material realities. Our final speaker is Leticia Sabse, whose paper examines the epistemic implications of translating concepts into other languages and academic contexts. Each speaker has 10 minutes, and following the presentations, I will open up the virtual space for Q&A. So I invite Armand and Isabel to take the floor.
Thank you, Armine, for the introduction. Okay, so it is a pleasure. Good morning, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be a part of this event, both as a coordinator, but also now as speaker. My name is Isabel, and I am not an academic by profession. And so my intervention will be perhaps somewhat unorthodox and definitely not very deep, but I just want to share a few thoughts on the call for papers and on the process of translating it back in November. So when I first came across the workshop, I had recently finished my degree at the gender department. And so I still felt relatively fluent in this very, very particular academic language that the call for papers was written in. And what I loved about it was that it was looking for concepts from the global south, that it was interested in different forms of world making, and that it was interested in geographical and linguistic spaces outside the usual Western Anglo-centric production of knowledge. And so I immediately shared it with a bunch of friends, most of them in Peru, because I'm Peruvian and German. But given what the workshop was trying to achieve, I did find the use of English as the sole vector for calling for conceptual diversity surprising and limiting. And this limit became evident when the people that I had contacted called me and wanted me to explain the workshop better to them. They were like, what is this? Concepts, theories, what's going on? And I was like, actually, I was like, maybe I didn't really understand it that well, or at least not well enough to speak about it impromptu in Spanish. And so I thought, okay, actually, maybe what we have to do is we have to translate the call for papers itself into multiple languages so that it can achieve its goal of seeking out these non-standard contexts. But when my friends and I started to work on the translation, we all came across significant difficulties in conveying particular phrases and concepts, beginning with the concept of coloniality itself. And that's because many of these debates, they reflect many of the debates that have been popularized in the Anglo academic world. So a phrase, translating a phrase into Spanish, for instance, that was like unidirectional travel of feminist and mainstream concepts. When I read it in English, I was like, yeah, I understand what that means. But then when I was trying to translate it to Spanish, I was like, wait, unidirectional from where to where? Unidirectional for whom? What feminist concepts? Mainstream where? And also mainstream for whom? So the very typical gender studies question. And so even when translated, what had at first seemed like the wide opening of a door to conceptual diversity from across the globe suddenly seemed extremely specifically located within a niche of Anglophone academia. And that specificity seemed to me as standing in the way of the very thing that the workshop was trying to achieve. So is translation enough? And this reminded me of when I attended a public high school in Austria 100 million years ago. And there it was compulsory to study Latin and ancient Greek in some cases. And for some reason, I ended up really liking Greek. I loved the challenge of making sense of a text, of looking at a phrase that was written in a different alphabet, of deciphering different phrases through a particular grammatical logic, and most of all of figuring out which of the multiple meanings that one word in Greek could have, I was going to use. And the sensation that I had, that I always had when engaging deeply with texts like this, was not so much one of having sort of brought broad knowledge into my language, but it was more a sensation of having been able to think deeply in two languages simultaneously. It was a sensation of leaving your own linguistic comfort zone behind, and immersing yourself, your heart, your soul, your thoughts, your feelings into multiple ways of thinking and being in the world. It meant to embrace conceptual diversity and richness by walking toward an unknown language. And to me, achieving this simultaneity doesn't necessarily mean that you have to speak fluently several languages. To me, it means that you have to take an interest in and study and understand other languages. And so to me, it's mind-boggling that the academic world is so dominated by one language. It's as though you listen to a piece of music and you decide to only tune into one of the instruments that's playing and think that you're listening to the whole thing. And so for those of us interested in decolonizing or reshaping knowledge production, I just think that we must also consider studying languages as a way to make sense of the world. And now I'll hand over to Armand.
Thank you, Isabel. That was a really good speech. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think I'll start off straight away. Firstly, I'd like to thank and commend the LSE Gender Department for their attempts at conceptual diversity through not only this workshop, but by agreeing with Isabel's suggestions to hire translators for their calls. I think this is really an important first step in achieving the conceptual diversity that we're all looking for. But I like to, my part is going to discuss how that in itself might not be enough. But before that, a bit of a background for me as the translator of this to Malay. I mostly speak Malay in a home or work setting in which I'm a researcher, but mostly in policymaking. My formative academic education has mostly been in English with focus of history and economics. And to me, this is really important background because I wanted to explain why I would be very used to the Anglophone academic institutions, and particularly the discourses and the languages used in it. So while I understand the need for the complex language use and the specificity of the language use, as Isabel said as well, I still think it's important to remember that this isn't very common language and is very much rooted in specific language and discourses in Anglo-American academic institutions. So in comparison, I think Malaysian discourse that often uses English, the discussions on knowledge productions often take different forms. So translating it had been a challenge because I'm not used to this kind of language basically in Malay. So as an example, the use of the word, the use of decolonization. Before the current title of the project, I think the subtitle was Decolonizing Knowledge Production in the Social Sciences. And though I do agree with not including the word decolonizing because of how loaded the term is, I do think to talk about Eurocentrism, you definitely need to talk about colonialism. So with what I think is interesting to talk about colonialism and how it's conceptualized in Malay is to translate decolonization, I use the Indonesian word decolonisme, which is a loan word compared to the Malay word nyah jajahan. Nyah being a prefix added to a word to append its meaning, much like de in decolonize. Jajahan meaning to subjugate. Google says that it's colonized, but that's not true. is the most common word describing colonialism in the 20th century in Malay, but because of its conflation of subjugation and colonization, which is why I think Google confuses the two, the use of the word, I think, loses its historical specificity of European-style colonialism. The word detaches specific formations of colonialism, such as the alienness of the conquering power and how that in itself can be used as a tool to administer the non-European colonies through race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. So instead, my opinion on the word, that it does have an effect of obfuscating, I think, power structures, since it can conflate colonialism and local power structures. To me, this is a result of specific historical conditions in which coloniality manifests itself in Malaysia, which has been a subject to a lot of literature in Malaysia, studying formations of power structures intimately linked to knowledge production, but particularly on how the colonial state in the 20th century managed to embed itself in local power structures and dominated discourse at the time. So to me, this material historical context is very loaded, and I notice it's quite difficult for me to explain it to a non-Malaysian audience. And that's specifically is, I think, what the next steps should be when we are trying to attempt conceptual diversity, in which not only the content and the language of the discourses in the Anglo-American institutions are directly translated, but there should be an attempt to understand and contextualize our knowledge in concrete material experiences of the periphery, especially if you want to attempt to achieve a bilateral flow of knowledge. Yeah, thank you. I think that's all for me.
Thank you, Armand and Isabel, for sharing your thoughts and also the experience of translating the call for papers. I think it's a very interesting exercise that you spoke about, and I think the points that you've raised about not direct translation, but really thinking and localizing and contextualizing are so important. So thank you, and I'm sure there will be questions and comments in the discussion. So now I turn to our second speakers, Olga Moon and Diana Kudaibergenova. I turn the virtual floor over to you both.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen. Yes, all good?
Yes, all good.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much for organizers for such a fantastic and inclusive conference. It's really a delight to be participating in a multilingual event. Beyond knowledge from the margins, new conceptual tools termed epistemic injustice in post-Soviet research is the title of our presentation today. And my name is Olga Moon. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Department of Education in Oxford. My colleague, Dr. Diana Kudaibergenova, is from the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. So today we will talk about epistemic injustice in global academic research production. We will focus on testimonial and hermeneutical injustice in post-Soviet research. And we will share our preliminary results from our empirical work as well. So the aim of our project is to understand how knowledge about Central Asia is produced in English language academic research. More specifically, it is to analyze what concepts are used to describe the political transformations in Central Asia. In order to navigate our research aim, we also rely similarly to one of the speakers from the first session, Professor Hakan, on the concepts of testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice happens to a speaker when her credibility as a knower is questioned based on her identity, for instance, as a woman or an ethnic minority. These two concepts are developed by a philosopher, Miranda Fricker. And the hermeneutical injustice is the type of injustice we are trying to understand in post-Soviet research. Is a type of injustice that happens on a collective level, in a collective epistemic realm. So it It's a type of injustice that is held in a collective realm based on the lack of a shared conceptualization. The example that Miranda Fricker uses in her book is, for example, if when the term sexual harassment didn't exist, many people who were affected by this were not really able to explain what happened to them. In the case of our research, Diana will talk more about the concepts that we engage with, but we also want to make an argument that the scholars from Central Asia have suffered, and the community from Central Asia suffered from a type of a hermeneutical epistemic injustice, where the academic community and also society at large were prevented from developing their own concepts, either in their own local language, by the dominance of the concepts that are developed in English language academic research on the topic of Central Asia. So the key terms in understanding hermeneutical injustice are hermeneutical marginalization and situated hermeneutical inequality. Today, we won't be able to go into details about these two concepts, but they're very important as they cause harm to the people who are involved in this process by preventing them in conceptualizing and understanding, for example, some of the events that happen to them by the lack of a conceptual tool relevant for them. And now I will give floor to Diana.
Thank you so much, Olga. So I'll continue from here. Our methodology is based on both textual and interview and survey-based methodology. We're gonna in the process of interviewing certain academics at the moment, both from within the region, but also working outside the region. The next slide, please. We're gonna show some preliminary findings and results. So basically what we're really focusing on is on the fetishization of local concepts that are used by Western academics working on Central Asia without further in-depth discussion of sort of what the local knowledge, and here it's in inverted commas, means. And just like, you know, what we mean by exotification or making the fetish of local concepts that they taking for the face value without looking further into the sort of embeddedness. And then what it creates is also harm for the fact that these terms are then so dominant and so, you know, the local researchers have no possibility or very little capacity to change these dominant frameworks and sort of create alternative views. And this obviously creates cleavages, certain gendered biases, stereotypes, and burden for the new production of knowledge or new sort of venues for thinking differently. Next slide, please, Olga. Thank you. And these terms, we're just using some of the examples, especially terms that have been, you know, in the realm of fetishization and exotification from the outside. These are terms that are basically used in the community as the terms that we live by and norms that we live by. For example, mahala, it's not only the Central Asian term for community, but also largely Asian term. It's the way that local communities are organized and neighborhoods, but also in sort of living social norms and conditions. Alakachu is probably one of the most harmful concepts that is used and often prescribed as a tradition, which is not. And we, as local scholars, are actively fighting against the idea that it is a tradition. It's actually not. It's a stereotype, and it's considered as a crime against women because it's about bridal kidnapping that is often prescribed in Central Asia as something that is ours, authentic or traditional, which is not, as I said. Aksakal or Aksakal court is another term that is often used in Western academia as this, like, you know, fetish. Literally, it means white bearded wise men, or it's a community of elderly leaders who occupy informal but important roles in navigating certain conflicts within the community or decision making. But also, what is often missed from that concept is that it's often seen as mainly patriarchal patrimonial, where some women also have access to that type of decision making and network. Kilin is one of the probably most difficult concept for us as local scholars, because we understand it as something very important. It's a concept of daughter-in-law that is sort of embedded in the analysis of gender inequalities within family and society, and also norms that are prescribed to young women who are getting married. But then we also have to be very self-reflective of how we use this term when we're discussing certain gender relations, so that we don't exotify it equally as some of our external colleagues do sometimes. So as a result, these local terms usually bring about ideas of patrimonial, traditional, and backward context, and often justify gendered and other forms of violence, which is a growing problem nowadays. And Another issue, which is the next slide, please. Another issue is that these terms often are framed quite rigidly in the sense of local knowledge, again, in converted in commas, and leave many Central Asian researchers in a state of conflict, that they are unable to challenge some of these dominant paradigms in the field without, as some of them say, making enemies in the high places, or leaving many of them in fear of being unable to publish their findings, apply for funding, or secure certain positions either abroad or at home. So as you can see, it becomes sort of like the hermeneutical injustice and burden for them. Others also voiced the idea that their alternative views of some of these dominant frameworks were not particularly popular with the established consensus. This specifically talks about the issue of alakachu or bridal kidnapping. When there are alternative ways of describing or discussing this context, it's often seen as sort of like, not very popular because it doesn't subscribe to the dominant perspective of what alakachu means in academic discourse in Central Asia. And some other local scholars also shared the idea that the point of view was informally in the field described by other scholars as biased or too self-involved, because these scholars worked in the local context of what we also call our home, and we're doing field work at home in Central Asia because we're coming from there. And I think it also connotates to one of the questions that are raised in the previous discussion about what for social anthropology it always means to be disengaged from your field and going to explore other places, whereas we as scholars from Central Asia, sort of first generation who are able to publish in English, we have to first pertain to our own home as a field in order to develop it, but we often are met with these burdens and injustices. So I leave it to Olga to make preliminary conclusions. Olga.
Yes, so yes, in our paper, we are also working through the concepts of marginalization and potential gaslighting of local researchers and researchers. So in the case of gaslighting and marginalization of local research, we see it as like relevant in relation to hermeneutical injustice. And if it happens on an interpersonal level, this is a case of a testimonial injustice to particular researchers. So indeed, it will also be interesting to look at silencing and how it happens in academic research when, on the one hand, it's when we realize that we are simplifying the binary of local and foreign, but it seems that the advance of knowledge in English language actually might be contributing either to silencing or marginalizations of other ways of knowing and being. Thank you so much for listening to our talk.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I think you've raised so many important points. I think this, highlighting the harm that is created is really important, and the types of harm that work. And just to add, I think this point about, being from there and from home and then doing that research and those dynamics, and having studied, trained as an anthropologist, I remember it was always about looking for the exotic. So it's part of the methodology, the practice, which leads to this fetishization and the Orientalist lens that doesn't seem to go away. So thank you for your really important presentation, and I look forward to discussing this further. Now to our third speaker, Macarena Gómez-Barris, who's going to now take the floor. Macarena?
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. So thank you so much to the organizers, and thank you for having me. I'm currently here upon Lenape territories at the East River in Brooklyn, New York, and was up at 4:45, and I'm so glad I got up at that hour to listen to these brilliant presentations. So I want to think with you today about ontological pluralism or ontological relationality as well. I'm interested in also considering the multiple audiences of our work and their engagements, and recently have been writing not only for the Colonial University and the Colonial Art Museum, but against it and in service of Strike MoMA in ways that I'm happy to speak about in Q&A. So I would suggest, as we know, and some have already said, that there's no colonial discipline that is currently formulated that thinks well with the proliferation of categories, since the colonial mode is both monocultural and monolingual. In my short presentation, I'm interested in contending with heterogeneous modes of address, transversal modes of engagement, and the dynamic work of decolonial hybridity. This is not the monoculture of the mind, as Vandina Shiva describes it, to signify the flattened, disciplinary, and untethered view from nowhere that feeds the extractive machine. The work we must do, I think, is to think, but also to make an act otherwise. And I'm very happy to be in an art school where I feel like I can do that with our students. This is the way to depart from groundwork, as Ira Livingston terms for eco-poetics, that epistemic proliferation that explodes the binary between nature and culture and the human and the more than human, and those kind of racial and colonial histories. In thinking with eco-poetics is a field actually that my friend and sureña comadre, the artist and poet Cecilia Vicuña, practically invented. Chickasaw two-spirited scholar Jody Bird importantly refers to grounded relationalities to name the indigenous forms of connections that do not split off human from non-human life. This leads me to the question I want to elaborate today. What if our theory worked not only to expand the explanatory power of a single discipline, but instead to multiply, inhabit, and enact relation in ways that do not cut us off, splinter off from each other? Here, I'm really interested in a kind of decolonial queer, femme, a trans-ecological vision that uses different kinds of intelligences, broad intelligence to imagine grounded and fluid work of dismantling, of unbuilding, of undoing, and reshaping. In The Death of the Western Colonial Paradigm, as Mapuche visual artist Francisco Buchaqueo dreams for us, the human female body Ophelia, painted in the pre-Raphaelite tradition and worked through that European tradition, is saturated in the liquid surround of the Maule River. This is a river being that has been cut off by the hydroelectric dam Ledesa. This image is not made for an extractive art market, but embeds itself in a history of representation that I would call grounded art. Such an image allows us to perceive and imagine a world of multi-species justice, a flexible world of water, the death of the colonial divide, to birth its beyond. So I will return in a minute to Mapuche cultural production to elaborate this liquid world. But here I want to think about how that image belongs to the realm of political struggle, of Mapuche indigenous solidarity that since the 16th century have been defending territories in the deep Biobío South in Chile against settler colonialism by first the conquistador presence and later the Republican Chilean settler nation, and most recent by the liberal democratic state that has worked historically to whiten, dispossess, and produce monoculture in the region. In current local and global struggles, the heteropatriarchal state is also a site of linguistic monoculture and paternal law. Any definition, I think, currently of international feminist struggle would have to run through Veronica Gago's book, but also as I addressed in my own Beyond the Pink Tide, we'd have to think about the state and the work it does exactly to dispossess. The Colectivo Tesis did this in 2019 ahead of the pandemic when it said, El violador eres tú, you are the rapist, pointing to the culture of violence that permeates all of our institutions and that pollutes the very idea of justice. As the Colectivo Tesis demands, and this is an abolitionist feminist vision, the social ecologies and connections have to be made in order to unweave the fabric of a culture of violence. So here I'm interested in this gesture, this pointing the finger, a socialist, feminist, decolonial ecological body part that points and demands embodied witness in order to remake our current political landscape. In the concept of plurality and ontological relations, we must also remember and mourn the losses of the colonial Anthropocene and its anti-groundwork, its ecocidal, genocidal, feminicidal foundation. Here, the Lenca environmental activist Berta Cáceres shows us the heterogeneous arts of land and water defense, and in this image, she too condemns and enacts a form of embodied witness. Killed by 6 armed militia in 2014 for her anti-extractivist work, Cáceres points as if to ask us to remember the living systems and our interdependence, our coexistence with the inhuman, as Mel Chen and Dana Luciano have queerly called, again, the inhuman. In this one gesture, Caceres points to the unraveling of a colonial extractive patriarchal matrix. Keep your focus on the Hualquerque River, she seems to say. Keep your extractive gaze off indigenous Lenca territories. In the search for decolonial knowledge generation, I intentionally use the term generation rather than production there, how do we dissolve all that stands between us without reproducing primitive, accumulative, extractive techno machines? How can we perceive and inhabit worlds where grounded forms of relationality allow us to see the other side of the colonial Anthropocene? The Headland Center for the Arts in Sausalito, California is a kind of space I love, a reoccupation and reconversion of sorts, an in-between place that is always in flux, taken back to be repurposed by a visionary utopic community. It is a former military site, and it occupies Native American coastal Miwok territory. Located on the Marin coastline in settler Northern California, its nearby geography is continuously remade by the elements of sea, fog, and wind. A decade ago now, or maybe even more than that, the social feminist painter Mae Stevens and I took long walks along the shoreline where solid land met the liquidity of the Pacific Ocean in a 700 million year exchange. We talked about our mutual commitment to making the paradigm of war against the earth visible in each of our work. At the time, I researched themes of memory and political violence and the disproportionate havoc authoritarianism wreaked upon poor female indigenous bodies during the Cold War and Afro-descendant communities during the Cold War for my book, Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile. The question of demilitarization was foremost on my mind. Mae, in her work in her studio, spent hours etching silver words onto canvas for her Sumptuous Sea of Words and Rivers series. And she gave a memorable artist talk that outlined her profound commitments to racial, feminist, environmental, and class justice, and what it meant to live her principles amidst the capitalist ideology of the quote-unquote American dream. For me, as a daughter of a Chilean political exile, I expressed my own disidentification from the racial state and the imperial petrol nation. We were comrades, and then we became close friends. Together, we explored the surrounding military bunkers that had been converted into studio spaces for artists, and we found each other along tables at mealtimes to exchange with each other's, with other makers, with thinkers, with activists. And here, I'd also like to suggest what it means to reconvert and to mutually convert ourselves, right? To not only think about intense sites of wildlife biodiversity as part of that reconversion, but also in relationship to each other and doing this work together. Upon that land, there were also Nike missiles that had been built and stored. From 1953 to 1979, the US Army operated close to 300 of such sites, ready to launch at a moment's notice against the Soviet Union. So this is just to remind us that we've been on the long edge of disaster for so many centuries, but we are differentially on that edge. It also was interesting to do that work and think about how the land itself has memory, how it bore the traces of Spanish colonialism and US empire upon coastal Miwok territory, and also as a gold rush extractive corridor. And this has all contributed to this apex moment that I'm calling the colonial Anthropocene. But also the importance of not 5 miles from the Headland Center for the Arts in 1969, the American Indian movement captured Alcatraz. So to think about these crucial political acts as disruptive of settler colonial indifference in our own categories in the social science, towards thinking about political militant histories that are important for us to reclaim in this moment. In this political fire of renewal, this is so different from the kind of settler fires of authoritarian capitalism. So what does it mean to harbor and think about these projects of land renewal, land memory in this particular moment? So how to kind of plurificate our work or think about the transversal. In this still from trans Mapuche artist, and this is actually an image from the colonial work in dispossessions, that I often think with, but I also want to think about a kind of counter image to the colonial archive. In this particular still from trans Mapuche artist Sebastián Calfoqueo's sumptuous video, Cauculen, we see the non-binary body held below the arch of a fallen tree, tied up by blue ropes. Calfoqueo's back forms an ontological bridge, a connection between indigenous and Winca or non-indigenous worlds, between the monocultural pine and eucalyptus plantations and the liquid world of ancestral territories, between IRL or in real life and mediated virtuality, between Chilean and Argentine nation state. In short, this kind of question of decolonial embodiment in the way that it hovers between colonialism and Waimapu territories. I'm interested in thinking with the work here of Sebastián, in part because it's not auto-testimonial, it's not auto-poiesis, it's not an image of a social encounter. Instead, it speaks to a territorial heart, a fluid embodiment, a representation of transposition, of fluctuation, of generative aliveness. And in their critique of the privatization of water that has become so scarce in the global South, the wearing of the Geneve star, speaking to the pluriverse of Mapuche stories of aquatic beings that live in the liquid coat underneath this groundwork. So here, I'm interested in thinking about resources differently, decolonizing and thinking about performance as a transversal repertoire, and also the power of these forms of indigenous non-binary living. In so many ways, how to think about decolonization cannot pass through depatriarchalizing. So these are the forms that I'd like for us to consider, to edge us closer to each other, to find spaces of collective we-ness, and to think further together rather than deeper into the abyss of the colonial Anthropocene. Those are some of the references that I talked about in my presentation today, and that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. These are the methodologies that we're interested in as a creative practice of thinking, being, moving otherwise at the Global South Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Macarena. Excellent presentation. I think you've highlighted this, the sense of urgency, the apex moment, as you called it, and the dynamic of unraveling and rebuilding and thinking in a utopian way. I like that term you used. How do we plurificate? That's new conjugation of that term, but I think there's so much to discuss in your paper and to think about the prefigurative politics that we need to embody to create those alternatives. So thank you very much. And now I turn the floor to our final speaker, Leticia Sapsai.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. I'm Leticia. Trabajo en LSE at the Gender Department, pero voy a hacer mi presentación en castellano, que es mi primera lengua. Y la voy a hacer en castellano en parte. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Suddenly, I was frozen. La voy a hacer en castellano en parte porque de alguna manera creo que performativamente va a poner en escena algunas de las cuestiones que quiero plantear en cuanto a qué se pone en juego cuando intentamos o cuando estamos comprometidos en la cuestión de traducir conceptos y marcos conceptuales. Y quiero responder a esta pregunta de qué se pone en juego en la traducción de conceptos a partir, sobre todo, de mi experiencia como coeditora de una colección de libros que se llama Critical South. Estoy poniendo el link a la colección en el chat. Así los que quieren pueden navegar por ahí mientras hablo. La colección de libros Critical South es una colección, es una de las iniciativas del Consorcio Internacional de Programas de Teoría Crítica, que fue una iniciativa que comenzó en el año 2017 y en la cual participé desde su concepción, fundada o sponsoreada por la Mellon Foundation. Y digo esto porque, bueno, efectivamente es una iniciativa que viene del norte atlántico de Estados Unidos, más concretamente, y en asociación con Inglaterra desde el momento en que la serie se publica por Polity Press. El punto de partida con el que nace la idea de la colección de libros fue la necesidad o la intención de, efectivamente, tratar de disrumpir lo que se entendía o lo que se puede entender hoy por hoy por teoría crítica. Y de alguna manera remapear eso que podemos entender de diversos modos como teoría crítica en un sentido amplio, tratando de dar visibilidad a trabajo emergente y establecido desde otros lugares, el sur, ahora me voy a referir a ello, que nunca estuvieron demasiado o bien representados en los anales de teoría crítica o de la teoría crítica. En este sentido, el proyecto nace como un gesto de traducción cultural, más allá de la traducción lingüística de los libros. ¿Y por qué este compromiso? Si partimos de un básico y común mínimo concepto de qué puede ser la teoría crítica como un tipo de teoría o modo de teorización comprometido con criticar las condiciones que hacen posible nuestro pensamiento presente, estaba claro para nosotros que era imposible criticar las condiciones presentes que hacen posible nuestro pensar y nuestros saberes sin disturbar el monoculturalismo y el monolingualismo de los espacios de producción de conocimiento que sostienen la supremacía de ciertas gramáticas del saber, o ciertas gramáticas que hacen posible pensar la crítica y las preguntas que nos podemos hacer acerca de nuestro presente y disturbar a sí mismo, como Sumi seguramente diría, su autoridad epistémica. Uno de los primeros objetivos de la colección era empezar a desestabilizar o contribuir a esa desestabilización de la autoridad epistémica de los consabidos espacios de producción de conocimiento. Y en este sentido, el título de la serie, Critical South, ya da alguna pista de esto. Obviamente el sur de este título no se refiere a una geografía particular, es un espacio geopolítico, económico, cultural, y en este sentido epistémico, y en este sentido el sureste es crítico, al menos en el sentido de que propone una crítica a la colonialidad del conocimiento, pero también es crítico en el sentido de que debe ser crítico de su propio nombre, debe ser crítico de la misma idea del sur, sobre todo cuando es asociada o comúnmente asociada con ideas como la de el sur global, que es una idea que de hecho se produjo en el norte, y con esto enfatizar que no podemos dar sentado que se entiende por esa otra edad del resto del mundo o del sur, y que solo el sur puede ser en un modo crítico. Ahora bien, ¿cómo embarcarse en esta tarea? ¿Cómo pasar de el desconfort del pensamiento crítico que de todos modos se satisface en su pureza y en su radicalidad a la impureza del hacer en un proyecto editorial concreto que, como digo, depende del dinero y de las instituciones ancladas en el norte. Como la traducción dentro del proyecto editorial de la colección se puede transformar o puede trabajar en sí misma como una forma de crítica y como una forma de hacer teoría. Obviamente, esta pregunta, que deriva en muchas otras, no está resuelta, no estuvo nunca resuelta, de modo que lo que voy a hacer en los minutos que me quedan es listar algunos de los problemas con los cuales nos hemos enfrentado en el trabajo con la serie, muy concretamente, y dar algunas pistas de cómo los hemos discutido. Y hablo en plural porque lo que queda claro también es que este trabajo hubiera sido imposible si no hubiera sido asumido colectivamente, trabajando con colegas y académicos o académiques de distintas partes del mundo, donde hemos estado discutiendo estas preguntas, no resolviéndolas, negociándolas, a lo largo de estos 4 o 5 años. Una de las primeras cuestiones que se nos plantearon, obviamente, eran las coordenadas espaciales y temporales que se configuraban en cada una de las traducciones de los títulos y en la serie que se iba conformando a través de las diversas traducciones. Y cómo, a pesar de nuestra crítica a la idea de los area studies, ciertas geografías se imponen, son stubborn, cabezonas, siguen ahí imponiéndose en cómo seleccionar títulos que den cuenta de los debates que surgen en distintas regiones del mundo. El otro punto es la historicidad, y en contra de cierto presentismo que invade la industria editorial académica y la industria académica en las universidades también, donde siempre se está buscando la última intervención, la más nueva, la más... dar cuenta y hacer honor a las grandes tradiciones históricas que hacen posible que un autor, una autora, aparezca en determinado contexto. Cómo no sucumbir al presentismo que puede reificar ciertas intervenciones como no necesariamente hereditarias de largas tradiciones de pensamiento que han sucedido en otros espacios. Y con esto, pretender disrumpir, por un lado, qué es lo que definimos por lo contemporáneo, qué es este presente que damos por supuesto, pero también cuestionar o contribuir al cuestionamiento de cómo se ha concebido la historia de ciertos debates, cómo se ha concebido la historia de los debates dentro del feminismo u otras disciplinas críticas e interdisciplinarias, cómo desestabilizar las historias que se cuentan sobre estos debates, y en este sentido apuntar a cómo desestabilizar cánones no solo de las disciplinas más tradicionales, sino de las disciplinas que se tienen a sí mismas por críticas y disruptoras. Y cuestionar en este sentido también el modo en que las preguntas que aparecen como relevantes en el presente están formuladas, qué marcos dan inteligibilidad a las preguntas que nos hacemos. qué es lo que aparece como relevante para nuestro presente histórico, qué es lo que aparece como anacrónico, desde distintos espacios. Segundo término, el otro desafío era cómo evitar la reificación de los conceptos, en el sentido de que cada concepto o cada marco conceptual que puede aparecer en los distintos títulos que hemos traducido y publicado, responde a o es parte de una plurivocidad, una polifonía de voces, una heterogeneidad, un palincesto de distintas capas de significado. Antes Armand hablaba del contexto en el cual estas voces aparecen y de alguna manera la intraducibilidad de ese contexto y de esa polifonía y de ese ser palincéstico y heterogéneo de estas voces. Y al mismo tiempo, como en la selección de autores, ir a buscar, o por lo menos no olvidar, las tensiones que se producen en estos espacios subalternos de producción de conocimiento y las propias hegemonías y los propios cánones. Cómo evitar en la selección de autores reproducir las relaciones de exclusión y de marginalización de distintas voces que se producen en estos distintos contextos locales. Now, he mencionado la palabra local, que es una palabra casi como un insulto, la entendería, cuando se menciona en determinados contextos. Claramente, la intención de la colección tiene que ver con sacudir la inercia epistémica que tiende a localizar o a espacializar ciertos lugares como productores de conocimiento y ciertos otros como receptores de conocimiento, y esta idea de, ¿no?, teoría producida en un lado y casos a estudiar en el otro. Pero lo que también queríamos cuestionar, o por lo menos traer a la discusión, es la tensión que se plantea entre distintos espacios del saber en relación a tradiciones de lo que dirían tradiciones canónicas del pensamiento occidental. Es decir, mientras que ciertas tendencias que entienden la descolonización del conocimiento, buscando en esos conceptos otros que podrían desengancharse completamente del pensamiento occidental, cómo trabajar también la tensión de conceptos que han emergido en el sur, en un diálogo crítico con lo que llamaríamos las bibliotecas del colonizador. Y cómo en ese diálogo crítico esas teorías o esos marcos conceptuales pasaron a ser otra cosa. El último punto, para ya ir terminando, es que para nosotros es sumamente, o se planteó como sumamente necesario también recalificar lo que entendemos como teoría y lo que entendemos como crítica. ¿Qué se entiende como teoría? ¿Qué es publicable en esta colección? ¿Y qué se entiende como crítica en el mismo sentido? Y acá nos hemos topado con muchas preguntas y cuestiones. ¿Hasta dónde el formato libro puede dar cuenta o puede dar espacio o lugar a otras formas de conocimiento que se producen con o bien textos más cortos o textos que no calificarían como académicos o teóricos según las tradiciones canónicas de lo que se entiende en Europa occidental y el Atlántico Norte, tradiciones donde el pensamiento crítico se ha dado a través del periodismo, del teatro, de otras artes, pero también cómo traer o visibilizar y hacer available, no me sale la palabra, trabajo que se ha producido en condiciones donde la gente no tiene la posibilidad de publicar un libro, que entonces la editorial puede ir, negociar los derechos y traducir, sino trabajo que se produce a través de blogs, en fanzines, en espacios colectivos. La voz colectiva también es una gran pregunta que se pone en tensión con la idea de autoría que ha regido o que rige a la industria editorial académica, y cómo traducir también esos otros formatos en un libro que pudiese participar de esta colección. Podría dar ejemplos de cómo hemos trabajado algunas de estas cuestiones, lo podemos hablar en el Q&A, pero básicamente, digamos, en mi abstract yo ponía cómo pensar la traducción como un método cartográfico, y pensaba la cartografía en este sentido deleuziano, ¿no? Empecé mi presentación hablando de remapeo, y la cartografía tiene que ver con esa idea, ¿no? Una forma de hacer mapas y reinterpretar mapas que den posibilidad a otros devenires, a otras intensidades que produzcan continuidades improbables que no habíamos pensado, y inesperadas conjunciones y diálogos que no habíamos imaginado, y disyunciones que pensábamos que eran imposibles de imaginar. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you very much. And I want to apologize for my own destabilizing, disruptive approach where I inadvertently read the order incorrectly and moved you to the end. So my apologies to you. But I think that was a fitting end, and you've given us so much to think about. And I'm going to, because I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to open it up immediately to the Q&A. So we have 4 questions here, and some of them are general questions and some are directed to specific people, to specific panelists. So I'll begin with the question from Flavia to Macarena about the terminology, Macarena, that you used to refer to strike MoMA, and if we're thinking about disruptive means of struggle as ni uno menos, or art as political aesthesis, is it not better to call it another sign? So Macarena, over to you.
Thank you. That was such an incredible panel. Thank you to my co-panelists. I learned so much. And I just wanted to first quickly say to Leticia, I agree with you about the term of the global South and its construction, but this is also about thinking the various strategies that make sense in certain moments and being flexible about those strategies and certain kinds of nomenclature that become visible to do this particular kind of work in specific moments. And the previous panel was addressing how the Center for Latin American Studies was such an important place to study Quechua. In the United States, as we know, the Latin American Studies Centers and all area studies, this carving out of the world comes out of this Cold War CIA legacy in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East. And so for me, it was an important place to do particular kind of work in Berkeley, but at the same time, I think we have to think about, you know, again, the kind of question of activities, radical revolutionary activities, insurgent activities within these spaces. And to address Flavia's question, I would say the same thing. I mean, I think the terminology of the strike has this wonderful genealogy within anarchist and communist histories to think about the feminist, kind of genealogy that is given by Veronica Gago and the Feminist International. The strike is really thinking through Rosa Luxemburg's question. And of course, the question of modern labor, but we have to think with coloniality, its ongoing persistence, and all of those currents, as well, I think, as forms of, you know, political left histories that have tried to figure out how to disrupt certain kinds of colonial and modern apparatuses. So for me, what's important again is that activities and under the sign of Strike MoMA have come together groups of Black, Indigenous, feminist, queer, trans, but also Palestinian activists, and to call out kind of the Palestinian dispossession and the Israeli military state. So to do that work together has been an abolitionist kind of imaginary that's come out. And I think strike there is literally to strike the heart of colonial modernity and the modern art museum that collects and imagines collection as the endpoint, right, of all this kind of petroleum extractive primitive accumulation. So I have a longer article that's coming out in the next few days over that. Look at the Global South Center for it. But thank you so much, Flavia. And thank you again to the panelists and the organizers.
Thank you, Macarena. Corina, gracias por su pregunta, which is in Spanish, and I have going to read the question in English for the attendees, but we will put the original question in Spanish in the chat. So the question is how to avoid romanticizing subaltern knowledge which emerges from the South without framing that knowledge as mythical or exotic. I'm referring to a tendency to see this type of knowledge as quote unquote refused by the mainstream academia or as exotic and mythical, which produces an acritical veneration of that knowledge. Which of our panelists would like to take that question? We could have a couple of respondents to that question. Leticia? Olga? Diana? Why don't you start, Leticia, and then we can go to if someone else wants to.
Okay, now I don't know whether to continue in English or in Spanish. Pero quiero, voy a comenzar con una nota sobre la idea de Global South, a la que Macarena hizo referencia. No puedo estar más de acuerdo, pero creo que precisamente el trabajo que se hace en el centro tiene que ver con, de alguna manera, desestabilizar la idea de qué pensamos que es el sur global. A eso me refería. No a que no podemos usar el nombre, sino que de alguna manera cuando nosotros tuvimos que elegir el título para la serie, poner el Critical Sur there tenía que ver con, no creas que ya sabes lo que es el sur global. Y ese es el trabajo que creo precisamente se hace desde el centro y desde otros tantos lugares. En ese sentido, no puede más que ser un nombre que si se honra como tal, tiene que ser crítico. Y esto creo que enlaza bien con la pregunta de Corina. Yo creo que Corina apunta de algún modo a algo que queda pendiente siempre cuando hablamos de traducciones, creo, que es el momento, que son las prácticas de lectura. En el proceso de la traducción, como escritores, y acá uso la E inclusiva, traductores o editores, o académicos, y producimos esos textos, podemos intentar hacer todo lo posible por incomodar a los lectores. Pero las prácticas de lectura están ellas mismas ya atravesadas por muchas capas de colonialidad del conocimiento. Entonces es muy difícil desestabilizar esas prácticas de lectura, que muchas veces, aún en contra o a una distancia de la intención autorial, terminan reificando, mistificando, exoticizando, etcétera, etcétera. Este es un ida y vuelta. Yo hablé desde un lugar donde, bueno, lo que puede hacer la colección en este caso, o lo que puedan hacer otras iniciativas, es hacer disponibles una serie de recursos. Ahora, ¿cómo se cambian esas prácticas de lectura? Bueno, estos espacios de discusión son una instancia. Se habló en el panel anterior cómo la universidad, cómo aquellos que estamos comprometidos con esto, incorporamos este conocimiento que se está produciendo, qué debates, qué formas de enseñanza y aprendizaje promovemos. Esa es otra instancia. Pero bueno, es cierto que esas prácticas de lectura es el gran problema y tiene otra temporalidad.
Thank you, Leticia. Olga and Diana, do you want to respond, or Isabel and Armand? Diana?
Yeah, okay. And I'm with Leticia on that as well. And that's, I guess, what our paper is really dedicated to, is that in order to fight this kind of, and I loved what Hakan said, the majoritarian canonical claims, we need to create criticism, first of all, the critique of these claims, and then we also need to be ourselves very aware and self-reflexive of not falling into that trap ourselves as well, right? Because when I'm thinking about it, I'm also thinking that, and I precisely agree with Leticia, it's the coloniality of knowledge, is that we as scholars from, let's say, not so universal places or not so universal knowledges, we sort of like in the beginning, we feel that the only way to be valid or the only way to be heard is to sort of, you're going to excavate something or find something, as you said, I mean, find something exotic from our backgrounds or from our spaces where we come from, and sort of like, legitimate it. And I see it also a lot with arts, especially when the Cold War ended and post-Soviet space became this like, amalgamated big Russian something, and everybody tried to find something, to speak about being different from Russian. And that's when we started like, our art started bringing out all these exotified ideas. And I think it's very, very important to be self-critical of that past, of that temporality, and also very self-reflexive about not producing these concepts anymore, and to find validity in something that is more, important both to your community, to where you're speaking back at home, but also to bring validity through other forms, and actually to decolonize that type of knowledge, and to bring more plurality again to our debates, and I know it's a hard battle. It's very hard to be the first ones as well to fight that battle, but nevertheless it's a very important one. And what we with Olga are trying to do is trying to bring it as sort of a collective force as well. as a collective voice from within. But very, very important to disturb, and debate and criticize these canons. Obviously, very, very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Olga, did you want to?
I'll just briefly add. Yeah, I'll briefly add to that I think it's a very important comment not to romanticize the local knowledge or the local knowledge producers as well. And this is, I think, for example, something that I'm trying to address in my doctoral research, but also when research to Central Asia, many researchers see it as either a homogeneous space or Kazakhstan is a homogeneous space. Obviously, it's not. And many researchers see ethnic Kazakhs as sort of the main group that has been wronged or marginalized, which is not the case. There are a lot of minorities who have been deported to Kazakhstan. There are a lot of minoritized groups within Kazakhstan, of ethnic groups whose knowledge is being continuously marginalized post-independence. So there should be, I think, multiple layers of continuous analysis and interrogation of how even the concepts that we use mainly speak to the ethnic Kyrgyz, ethnic Kazakh people. So in many ways, for example, I'm partly ethnically Korean. In no way ethnic Korean knowledge of Kazakhstani citizens is seen as legitimate or as sort of building the nation state in Kazakhstan post-independence. So in a way, deported Koreans suffered in Soviet times, and in post-independence times, I really do not see these sort of attitudes significantly changing to the knowledge of different minority ethnic groups. So of course, I think this category of global South, this category of sort of some academics discovering Central Asia, especially in the UK, sometimes really miss the fact that Central Asia is diverse, Kazakhstan is diverse. You don't have to be an ethnic Kazakh to be from Kazakhstan. We don't have time and scope to go into that discussion, but I of course understand that the local concepts and the local knowledge is not neutral. It has to be interrogated in the same way as we interrogate all sorts of other knowledges. It's neither innocent or in no way the concepts of power and privilege and identity are all present in the so-called global South.
Yeah, thank you. Isabel and Armand, did you want to come into that question, or should I go to the next question? Next question? Great. So our next question comes from Ayça Çubukçu, and Ayça asks, if we reflect on the concept, quote unquote, the rest of the world, what kind of epistemic and political work does that concept do? I'm looking to the panel. Macarena, do you want to respond? Mm-hmm.
I think this is a great teaching question, really, because the answer is embedded within the question already, which is to suggest that by doing this rest of the world moment, we're really kind of hegemonically reproducing the kind of colonial gaze. And I think, that does a certain kind of mapping work. And Leticia was talking about the importance of remapping and, rethinking those kinds of geographies. And I mean, I think this is really important, and the entire panel has been considering this question, right, of how to think about languages that actually get at both local vernaculars, specificity, epistemic, not difference, but plurality, and not reproduce the kind of colonial matrix. And this is the work that we have to do, but I think part of it is also allowing ourselves space. And what I try to do in my presentation was really not to model, but to think about methods or languages or conceptual frameworks that, aren't grounded in colonial ethnography, but are about certain kinds of relationships with artists, or with, different kinds of political communities. And I do want to retain that aspect here. If we are to retain something like a critical decolonial social sciences that is informed by a lot of the perspectives that we've been talking about, what does that look like on the other side? And I do want to suggest again that I think, you know, we don't have a lot of time to think about these questions. And I think we have to, the acceleration that's happening in terms of climate crisis is also happening in academia. I think we're all feeling, as you mentioned, Armine, this kind of political urgency right now, and the kind of sense of temporality and need to not provide solutionist frameworks, but to actually engage each other on these questions, both to unworld, unbuild, and remake. And I think I learned so much from the panelists in this project, and also this last question that really said it, you know, it's not about the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Macarena. Does anyone else like to respond to that question? No? Our next question is linked in some ways, and is a question that is asking, again, about how we do things differently. And if North Atlantic academics and researchers are the net beneficiaries of translation, how can we disrupt this dynamic? How can we redistribute the epistemological benefits of translation? So it's really bringing it back to about our role. You know, we can critique, but what do we do differently? So I think I will throw that open the floor to our panelists. Anyone, please, I can see you also. If you want to raise your hand or signal to me that you'd like to speak, I will call on you.
Okay, I will give
Isabel,
it a try.
please.
Yeah, even though, can you just repeat it one more time, the question though?
Yes, absolutely. So the question, just disappeared. Here we go. So the question is asking if we are, as if North Atlantic academics and researchers are the net beneficiaries of translation, how can we disrupt this dynamic? How can we redistribute the epistemological benefits of translation? So how do we do things differently?
Okay, super easy question. I will just say, maybe share just a few thoughts, because I'm not very steadfast on all these terminologies and so on. But one of the, and I think this might be a bit of a controversial thought, but one of the things that I was really thinking deeply about during the degree, the gender studies degree, also before doing the translation for the call for papers, was languages, because I was really just sort of confused as to, okay, yes, we're in a UK university, obviously we have to read all of this in English, but it just seemed so, I don't know, all of the things I said in my intervention. And so I did think about, like, how would it be possible to sort of create like simultaneous translation of everything into all languages, so that the power of languages sort of disappeared. And when I did translations, I do use, and I'm sure other people do too, but they don't admit it, Google Translate, which for some languages works really well. And I spoke to a friend who worked in parts of this Google Translate development for different languages. And it just occurred to me that I think AI, artificial intelligence, actually could be extremely interesting to use for translation, obviously without going into sort of the apocalyptic idea of what AI can do, but actually thinking, what if AI were so that it could easily and immediately translate or bring into life all these nuances that you have to catch when translating or when thinking in different contexts, and therefore also sort of could immediately disrupt north-south directions, because it could sort of make it available in all languages. I was sort of dreaming that up. So that's my, I don't know, those are like my thoughts, or one thought.
Thanks, Isabel. I mean, as you're speaking about AI and these other technologies, I mean, the one thought that comes to me, and I want to again applaud the organizers for this conference for the efforts you've made, is the fact of financing, right? Is the fact that all of this making things accessible comes with a cost. And I know from our practice on Atlantic Fellows, when we bring in British Sign Language interpreters, when we close caption, when we bring in, other interpreters from other languages, it's a cost. And when I've spoken to colleagues in other departments, some of them say we can't do that. So it's, bringing together not just the will to do it, but the possibility, and I'm not saying everything has to hinge on money, but sometimes it ends up being that, unfortunately. Armand.
Hi, yeah, so I think your point on like financing is actually what I was thinking about as well, where exotification, I think, becomes inevitable when it comes because of material inequalities, which I think is actually the main barrier. I think everything else where we can mitigate through academia and whatnot, I think that's really good. I think that's something that should be done. But I think as long as those kind of material inequalities exist, I think that is the main barrier when it comes to the exotification of local knowledge or the other. I think it's quite difficult for someone from Malaysia to access a lot of the things from the North Atlantic academia basically. And I think, yeah, I think while all others being very mitigatory, I think that's why certain people and cultures can also be exotified more when it comes to a lot of these sort of things. And yeah.
Thanks, Armand. Other panelists want to comment on that?
Well, I can.
Leticia?
A very kind of grounded answer, I would say. Lo primero que quería decir es que no necesariamente traducir al inglés hace que los únicos beneficiarios de esas traducciones sean los scholars based in the North Atlantic West. Uno de los problemas con los cuales nos enfrentamos es cómo trabajar o cómo negociar el hecho de que inglés, en muchas instancias, not the least the academic one, es la lengua franca. Y que cuando nosotros empezamos con The Critical South, ok, ¿por qué en inglés? ¿No? Y la lengua nos dimos cuenta que teníamos que triangular a través de la lengua inglesa para promocionar en gran medida diálogos cross-regionales o interregionales, donde el inglés se convertía en la lengua franca. ¿Cómo desestabilizar eso? Eso es muy, muy difícil de desestabilizar. También me parece importante recalcar que toda esta idea de traducir al inglés trabajo que no era accesible al inglés tiene que ver con looking back a un proceso de traducción que se caracterizó históricamente y también en el presente por traducir todo aquello producido en inglés y en menor medida, depende de las disciplinas, francés y alemán, a otras lenguas, a otros contextos. ¿Qué pasa si redireccionamos la dirección de la traducción? Esa es la pregunta. Una forma que nosotros pensamos o intentamos para desarticular un poco esto en el consorcio es que junto con Critical South tenemos otras dos colecciones, o una colección que trabaja in a double bind, in a double way, que se llama Sur-Sud o Sud-Sur, donde traducimos, encontramos trabajo producido en francés, en el Sud, y lo traducimos al español, al sur, y para esto estamos asociados con dos editoriales independientes, una en Argentina, Tinta Limón, en la que Verónica Gago está involucrada, y otra Jimsang de Senegal, en la que está involucrado Felvin Sarr, y traducir trabajo producido en castellano al francés y publicado por esta editorial senegalesa. Ahora bien, el francés y el castellano también son lenguas con siglos de pasado imperial y son lenguas colonizantes. ¿Cómo salir de ahí?
Thank you. Thank you, Leticia. We are now at the end of time, but I'm going to take advantage of my role as chair and ask each panelist for a very quick 1 minute. I'm going to be very strict with this and cut people off because just to give you 1 minute to reflect. So I will start with Isabel and then go through my screen. So I'm going to go through.
Oh, just to reflect on this panel.
Yes.
Oh, oof.
And just say any last words on the panel.
No, the last word is that Leticia did the typical thing of ending with more questions than answers, which then leaves me thinking and makes me think that this idea of how to do this translating and everything involved in it is very complex. But I do think I still want to. My thought is I want to tackle that somehow in my life.
Excellent. Thank you. Armand.
Yeah, I think as well, translating has been a difficult task, I think, especially translating something that's from Anglo-American institution to Malay. And I do think, especially after this panel as well, I did rethink about how much my translating would, could it possibly help, or maybe if I didn't do it properly, it could have possibly added to the issues of inequality, and how it could have added to the issues of maybe exotifying the global south. But I think, yeah, I think those are just the thoughts that left me reflecting on. I of course don't have the answers for that right now because yeah.
Thanks, Armand. Macarena?
Okay, I didn't realize I was going next. That's great. I think it brings me back, the final thought brings me back to the previous panel and Audre Lorde, and how can we dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? And I think the important thing there is really thinking about the multiple tools, but also the second part that's often lost, the importance of dismantling the master's house by any means necessary, right? And so I think the kind of means of multiplicity that I heard on this panel, not relying on the or, but thinking in that third space, the kind of, not that these binaries, one or the other, but many, many strategies, again, many, many ways of thinking, many ways of bringing this material forward. And I'm just really moved by, the work that's being done in the UK right now, by scholars of color, by scholars from other areas, and really listening. And it was resonant for me, this kind of first generation work that we've done in often very uninviting, shall we say, unwelcoming environments, and the importance of actually that stickedness, or sticking to it, and thinking together, and not replicating the master's tools in the hierarchical competitive fashion, but this way of working that we have that's about non-extractive relationality, non-extractive modes of engagement, and thinking and citational practice that really takes us precisely out of the same old ways.
Thanks, Macarena. Leticia, I'm just going on who I see on my screen, so however Zoom has lined you all up. Leticia, 1 minute.
Ok, primero que nada, quiero, que no lo dije antes, quiero agradecer a Sumi y a Mary por esta iniciativa que me parece alucinante, y a todo el big equipo de gente que lo ha hecho posible, y a todos los participantes, les participantes. Y agradecer a los panelistas del panel anterior y a mis camaradas here por hacer posible que podamos pensar esto together. Y tengo una lista de preguntas que se va haciendo más larga a medida que el día avanza, y quiero agradecer eso. Creo que sí, que Macarena mencionó en estas últimas palabras, cómo trabajar con digamos, críticamente con nuestras propias prácticas citacionales, y yo insistiría, esto se relaciona también con nuestras propias prácticas de lectura, ¿no? Hay una decisión política cuando decidimos con quiénes queremos estar en conversación, quiénes queremos que nos lean, cuáles son nuestros political commitments, y de alguna manera cómo estos pueden o no estar en tensión con nuestros proyectos como scholars y nuestras carreras, ¿no? Y también quién tiene el privilegio de poder hacer eso.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off, but I know we're over time. So Olga and then Diana.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank everyone also for listening, because at the moment it seems that being heard without interruptions is also a sort of a privilege, and the opportunity to discuss this work in progress in a kind fashion, it's really motivates me to stay in academia after graduation. I wish all conferences would be as inclusive. And, yeah.
Brilliant. I agree. Diana, last word to you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank all the organizers, and most importantly, and I've been saying it on social media already, I think it's a privilege to be part of this group. And I think I'm taking away two things from this panel and the panel before, is that, first of all, we all coming from different backgrounds, but we all speaking of the same problem. So it means that, you know, the urgency is there and we need to address it immediately. And second of all, I'm very grateful, and I think it's a privilege to be part of this group, because the only way we can dismantle the master's house is to do it in the community and together. So I'm very, very privileged, and I'm thankful to my co-author, to Olga, for bringing me here, and also for meeting you all, because I think that the power is in the community. So I'm really, really grateful to be part of this community. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. It's been my privilege really listening to you all. And I also leave with more questions than answers, which I think is the best way to measure how successful this has been. So thank you. Our next panel begins at 2:15, and I'll turn over to the organizers if you want to say anything before we end.